And as you just heard, baristas at a Starbucks in the University District walked off the job. That video you just saw was sent to us by the Union Workers United. Today we saw baristas and their allies also rallying outside the store in University Way. The union tells us baristas are demanding higher wages and more staffing and protections.
I think it's important to show the shareholders that we make their profits and that our movement will continue.
The rally happening on the eve of the company's annual shareholder meeting. The coffee chain has been struggling with a decline in sales that has lasted for the past year. We reached out to Starbucks for comment about the latest rally. They responding saying, quote, "It is disappointing to see Workers United disrupt our stores and undermine the ongoing mediation process for single store contracts. Since last April, Starbucks and Workers United have made significant progress through respectful dialogue and have reached a number of important agreements."
If you want a real-world example of what happens when ideological activism collides with basic economic reality, you don't have to look any further than what's happening right now with Starbucks employees in Seattle, because a lot of these workers who have been heavily involved in union organizing, repeated strikes, and escalating demands are starting to run into a consequence that honestly should not surprise anyone who understands how business works or operates, which is that if you constantly position yourself in a position to your employer, if every few months there's another disruption, another protest, another set of demands for increased wages, expanded benefits, and more control over workplace decisions, eventually the company is going to reassess whether continuing operations in that environment actually makes sense. And what we're seeing now is that in many cases, the answer is no, because these employees have been striking and protesting quite frequently. And instead of that leading to a sustainable long-term outcome in their favor, we are now seeing stores close, locations shut down, and jobs disappear, including a high-profile Starbucks roastery in Seattle where workers went on a strike and that location ultimately closed. And this is where the conversation needs to move beyond slogans and into reality, because businesses are not designed to function as platforms for continuous internal conflict. They are structured to operate efficiently, serve customers, and remain profitable. And when that structure is consistently disrupted, there are consequences. So what we're going to do here is break down exactly what's been happening, what these workers were pushing for, and why these closures are occurring, and what this tells us about the broader economic and political mindset behind these movements. Hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and check this out.
This is a 5-day strike that started on Friday. Now, union workers are saying that the contract negotiations have been lacking any progress when it comes to negotiating with Starbucks. Then you have Starbucks saying that the union's asks for them, their demands are just not sustainable. You can even see the handful of workers that are striking this morning here. That is the roastery on Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. Now, according to the Starbucks company, Workers United proposals rather call for an immediate increase in the minimum wage of hourly partners by 64% and by 77% over the life of a 3-year contract. According to the union, the strikes will end if Starbucks honors a commitment that it made in February to work with its union workers on collective bargaining agreements. The company says it is focused on making the employee experience better while offering a competitive average pay of $18 per hour with benefits. Starbucks says that baristas working at least 20 hours a week can make an average of $30 per hour. Now, over the course of 2024, Starbucks Workers United baristas say that it has powered a, quote, winning streak of organizing that has led baristas at more than 100 stores to join the union. Now, the union says it is driving forward a nationwide movement of more than 10% of baristas working together to win workplace protections. For example, they want to focus on core issues like respect, living wages, racial and gender equity, and fair scheduling. And this is happening at more than 500 Starbucks locations.
We're not out here just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for baristas nationwide, and we're fighting for low-paid work to no longer be considered low-paid work. We want to be able to live and be in the cities that we work in.
several months later.
Starbucks Reserve stores in Seattle's Capitol Hill and Soto neighborhoods are now closed. The company confirming this morning the two are closing as part of 180 stores being shut down as the company restructures. The Capitol Hill Reserve Roastery unionized in 2022, and they have been demanding more staffing, on-the-job protections, and pay. The company says this did not have to do with the store employees' decision to unionize, saying the reason was, quote, "We don't see a path to financial performance." Seattle Times business reporter Megan Ululani Boyanton joining us live now. Thanks for being here, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me, Sabira.
So, Megan, what else is Starbucks saying about what led to these closures?
Sure. So this is part of a $1 billion corporate restructuring plan that's happening under the newest CEO, Brian Niccol. So to give some context, earlier this year, there was already a layoff that occurred of about 1,100 corporate employees. So the announcement today constituted another round of layoffs, a second round. So that's going to affect 900 corporate employees. On top of that, they added that there's going to be an unspecified number.
So yeah, you saw that. And that's what's important to understand is that this didn't just happen overnight. This has been building for a while because that first closure we're talking about goes all the way back to around September of last year. And at that time, Starbucks came out and said, look, this has nothing to do with unionization. This has nothing to do with activism. We just don't see a path towards profitability for this location. And on the surface, that sounds like a neutral, corporate, careful worded statement. But let's be honest about what's really going on here, because large corporations are not going to openly pick a political fight with highly organized activist employees if they don't have to, especially in a place like Seattle, where kind of activism is culturally and politically dominant. So instead, they frame it in a language of business metrics and long-term viability, but profitability doesn't exist in a vacuum. And one of the biggest variables that determines whether a store is profitable or not is labor cost. And when you have unionized workers, unionized, consistently pushing for higher wages, $30 an hour, $35, $40, and even $50 an hour in some cases, on top of expanded benefits like full healthcare coverage, retirement packages. We're talking about tuition assistance here and a wide range of additional demands that go well beyond what these jobs historically offered. That cost structure starts to change dramatically. And this is not a moral judgment. This is basic economics, because labor is one of the most expensive inputs in any business has. And when that input becomes too expensive relative to the revenue the store brings in, the model breaks down. And when the model breaks down, the business has to make a decision, which brings us to the next example of out of Seattle is in the university district, where we're seeing the exact same pattern play out again. Employees organizing, striking, demanding more compensation and expanded benefits, creating ongoing disruption within the workplace. And now Starbucks is shutting that location down as well. And I want you guys to check this out.
Starbucks on University Way will close its doors next month. The announcement comes just weeks after the end of a 3-month strike at that location. The shop's last day will be April 5th. A manager at the University Way shop says that the strike ended because workers couldn't afford to continue without pay. Employees say they were not given a specific reason for the closure, and that Starbucks told the location workers that they would not be able to transfer to different locations. The Union for Starbucks Workers is criticizing the store closure, saying, quote, Starbucks continues to fail its hometown after laying off thousands of corporate employees, opening a new office in Nashville, and closing its flagship store. CEO Brian Niccol is yet again upending lives of employees and disrupting customers with no notice or justification. Fox 13 reached out to Starbucks for its side of the story. Once we get the company's response, we'll bring it to you here on Fox 13.
Well, there you have it, right? And what makes this case even more significant is that, according to the reports, these employees are not even being given an option to transfer to another store, which is something that the company has allowed in other situations, meaning that in practical terms, these workers who participated in that cycle of activism are now simply out of a job. And that raises a serious question about the long-term consequences of this strategy, because at some point you have to ask whether these actions are actually improving workers' lives or whether they're accelerating the elimination of the very jobs these workers depend on. And that's the mic drop for you right there. Now, when we look at this article here, a Starbucks on the Ave to close permanently April 5th. So when you look at this situation more closely, what really stands out is how different this response is compared to what we typically see. Because in most cases, Starbucks will try to soften the blow by saying, look, we're closing this location, but you could transfer to another store. Maybe you have to commute a little further. Maybe it's inconvenient, but at least you still have a job. There's still some continuity there. And that's usually how companies handle these things when they want to avoid backlash. But in this case, that option was taken off the table entirely. The same store that had just been actively participating in strikes and union activity gets shut down, and employers are told not only that the store is closing, but that they cannot transfer and will have to reapply from scratch if they want to work for the company again, which in practical terms means you're out, you're done. And that tells you quite a bit about how the company is interpreting what's been happening internally. Because at some point, businesses stop viewing this as normal labor negotiation and start viewing it as ongoing operational disruption. And that cannot sustainably be managed, right? That sustainability can't be managed. And when that line gets crossed, the response becomes much more decisive. Now, layered on top of that is the policy environment that's enabling a lot of this behavior, particularly in states like Washington, where you have legislation that effectively subsidizes striking. So you had a worker in this case, which you about to read the article, explaining that the strike itself ended not because demands were met, but because people simply couldn't afford to continue without pay. And that's where this 2025 policy comes into play, because after a 21-day waiting period, union members began eligible for up to $750 per week during the strike, funded through the unemployment system. But that benefit only lasts for 6 weeks. And what that does, whether intentionally or not, is creates a very distorted incentive structure, because now you are partially insulating workers from the immediate financial consequences of choosing not to work, which makes strikes easier to initiate and sustain, at least in the short term. And when you combine that with an already highly activist workplace culture, you end up with a cycle where striking becomes normalized rather than a last resort. And that has real downstream effects, because businesses are not just reacting to one isolated event. They're reacting to a pattern. And if that pattern signals instability, rising costs, and ongoing disruption, then leaving becomes a rational decision from their perspective. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, right? And of course, the response from some of the workers is that this feels like retaliation, that the closure coming right after the strike is somehow punitive. But from a business standpoint, the explanation is much simpler. If a location is no longer viable financially or operationally, it gets shut down. And that's true regardless of the political framing around it. But the human impact is still real. You have employees saying they may have to leave Seattle entirely. Others say the situation doesn't even feel real, right? And I don't dismiss that. Losing a job is serious, but it also underscores the risk of engaging in a strategy that assumes the employer will absorb the cost of escalating demands. You basically protested yourself out of a job by demanding and telling a company what they should do. And look, because sometimes they won't. Sometimes they just exit altogether because you are demanding from your employer to absorb the cost of escalating demands that you demand. And that's the part of this conversation that often gets ignored, which brings in the bigger picture here, because this is not just about one Starbucks or even one city. This is a broader economic mindset. So when you guys see this, right, and it says Starbucks on the Ave to close permanently April 5th. Starbucks on University Way Northeast will permanently close April 5th, 2025. Company management announced to their workers Tuesday. A spokesperson Starbucks confirmed the closure to the Daily. As a standard course of business, we regularly review how our coffee houses serve their neighborhoods, and if they are meeting customers where they are, a Starbucks spokesperson wrote in an email. Sometimes that means investing in updates or trying new formats. Other times it means making a difficult decision to close a location that no longer fits how people in that community live, work, or gather, right? And it says right here, the permanent closure announcement just comes 5 weeks after a 3-month strike at the Ave location, which left the location temporarily closed from November 13th, 2025 until February 16, 2026. Unionized and Starbucks workers united. Employees at the Ave location joined the nationwide strike on Starbucks Red Cup Day in November to demand better hours to improve staffing, higher take-home pay, resolutions to outstanding unfair labor practices, and a fair contract. The Ave location filed for union representation April 26, 2022. A contract has yet to be finalized with the union. And then as it says, as Avicler, a UW alum, And Starbucks shift supervisor, who has worked at the Ave location for nearly 5 years, said the strike ended because workers couldn't afford to continue without pay. After a 21-day waiting period, union members were eligible for $750 per week while striking due to a bill passed in 2025 by Governor Bob Ferguson. But the bill only provides pay up for 6 weeks. And that's what I was talking about. So basically, they're incentivizing and continue to attack their employer through the governor, right? So you're basically now sitting here using monies to continue to strike against your employer that's paying and put money in your pocket. It comes off very ungrateful. And you're trying to tell a business what to do. Employees returned to normal working function after ending the strike, and the closure announcement came as a complete shock, according to Avuclair. According to Avuclair, there we go. Avuclair, the closure appears to be a retaliation for the store's union action. Aiden Hugasadi, a barista who started at the Ave location in October 2025, said that losing his job after the strike means he'll have to move out of Seattle entirely. And that's what I was talking about, folks. So you guys see that, you read that with me, you followed along. When you look at this, right, this is about a broader economic mindset that treats profit as something inherently negative and assumes that companies can indefinitely increase wages or do it forever and expand benefits and tolerate constant disruption without any structural consequences. And that's simply not how markets function. Profit is what allows a business to continue to operate, to continue to employ people, to expand, to invest. And when that disappears, so does the jobs. And that's why you're seeing situations like this where workers push for higher wages, $30, $40, $50 an hour, and expanded benefits for positions that the market does not typically value at that level. And again, that's not about disrespecting the work. It's about understanding how value is determined in a free market system. Because if the cost of labor rises beyond what the business model can support, those costs get passed on to the customers, the consumers, through higher prices. And at a certain point, consumers stop buying. And when that happens, the entire system, contract, store close, jobs disappear, and everyone ends up worse off. So when people say this outcome is shocking or unfair, I think what it really reflects is a disconnect between the expectations being set by activist movements and the realities of how businesses actually operate. Because you could demand higher wages all day long, but if those wages are not supported by the underlying economics, they don't materialize into a sustainable way. Or worse, they result in the elimination of the job entirely. And that's what makes the situation such a clear example of policy, ideology, and economic reality colliding in a very tangible way. Because when you incentivize striking, normal disruption, and simultaneously increase the cost of labor, you are putting pressure on the very system that provides those jobs, in this case, Starbucks, in the first place. And eventually something has to give. And in this case, what gave was the store itself. So when you zoom out and you look at the broader trend, this is just not about Starbucks. It's about what happens when a political economic philosophy is implemented in the real world without fully accounting for the trade-offs. Right? Businesses want to pay high wages, but if they're not making enough money, they can't pay high wages because those trade-offs are unavoidable. And we're watching them play out in real time with real consequences for the very workers these policies are supposed to help. And that's why I say this is less about corporate decisions in isolation and more about systemic issue and how we are thinking about labor value and incentives in today's economy. So ultimately, the takeaway here is pretty straightforward. If you turn your workplace into a constant battleground, if you push demands that outspace what the business can realistically sustain, if policy steps in to artificially support that behavior, you shouldn't be surprised when the end result is fewer jobs, not better ones. And I think that's a lesson that's going to continue repeating itself until there's a more honest conversation about how all these pieces actually fit together. Let me know what you guys think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, subscribe to the channel, turn your post notifications on so you don't miss the next one. Peace.